loving kindness meditation. And when I first started learning meditation, it's probably about 25 years ago is when I started. I did start with the Galenka method, and he would do periods of loving kindness, but it was basically him sending it to all of the participants, and we weren't taught to that stage how to do it. So I always had this kind of impression it was just something you did for 5 or 10 minutes, and this meditation can be used that way. So if you're just starting a meditation, if you're able to develop that kind of feeling or just feel good about doing it, like I say, if you have interest and you're enjoying it, that's a great foundation then to go into just body awareness or breath meditation or whatever meditation we like doing. So it can be a preliminary, but it can also be taught as a concentration practice in and of itself, that you continually keep these phrases going, and you learn more and more concentration and calm, mindfulness by doing it as a full practice. And so I guess when I did write down there's probably a lot more if I thought about it, but I kind of wrote down for myself the 4 main reasons. I think there's some sort of misunderstandings, or I can see why people might have aversion to doing loving kindness. I heard Bhante Gunaratana once was going to a retreat, and they didn't really have a theme for it beforehand, and they asked Bhante, what they were going to teach, and he said, I was going to do loving kindness, and I hate doing loving kindness. It's not an uncommon occurrence. And so for me, it was after learning 2 or 3 techniques, I finally did do a retreat with just loving kindness as the main focus. And it was the first meditation that I really clicked with me, I like doing this. And so I picked it up for 2 or 3 years. It became my primary meditation technique. And then about that point, I joined the monastic order, and I don't know why, but it all of a sudden I had difficulty doing as a meditation practice, and it was almost like it was kind of hard to develop that feeling. It was just I felt like I was putting a lot of effort into it and wasn't really feeling that way, and I kind of maybe assumed that it was since I was in the monastic form, and it was going from living alone basically most of my life to now living in a community and having to learn those kinds of skills, or with chanting, the monastic form, we have lots of chanting, a lot more group practice. So I wasn't sure, but I thought, well, it's just the conditions have changed, and I didn't give it any much thought. I had enough meditation, other things that I was developing, so I was I wasn't worried about it. Then a few years later, I was living with a monk here in the United States, about my age and same tradition, but he recently became an abbot of a monastery and returned from Thailand, where he had a Thai teacher who was his primary teacher, and he asked this teacher, now that I'm sort of the leader in a community, kind of like I and Bhante here are, they asked him what his practice should be or how he should be, and his teacher said, you should be developing loving kindness. Metta meditation should be your kind of your primary. And he said this to his group when he came back from the trip, and he said my reaction was, I don't know how to do that. And I just kind of laughed, because I was like, I've known this monk for a long time. He's full of metta. I know I've heard him give talks on loving kindness. What does he mean he doesn't know how to do that? And the next day there were 3 of us. We were going on alms round, and I asked him. I said, "What did you mean by that?" Or I guess I just started contemplating in my head, what do you possibly mean by that? And then I was like, well, you haven't done loving kindness meditation for about 3 years. What do you know about it? And I realized yeah, I actually had aversion to it, to doing the practice. I would I knew how to do the phrases, I could go through it, but I really wasn't developing that feeling. I was like, well, what do I actually know about it? And then, so I started, well, actually, the three of us that were there, it was the middle of a winter retreat, so the three of us got together and we sort of made a list of like every single Dhamma talk we'd ever heard about loving kindness, every book, every article that we'd ever read, we just got this big list. And so for 3 months, every night we'd get together and we'd listen to one of these talks, or we'd have a discussion together about all of these different subjects. So we really kind of dove into it deep. And one thing that I kind of remembered as we were going through this about myself was it was actually like where I became a Buddhist. I was living in an ashram, very large ashram, in the Kripalu Center. Some of you might know that, in Lenox, Massachusetts. And I was on staff there, and that's when I was really, really doing the loving kindness. And there was this guy who was on the staff that I worked in the same department, and he had dreadlocks and kind of looked like Bob Marley, and I think he was stoned half the time he was there on the staff. And every evening I'd go do like an hour of yoga, and then I'd skip the meal and I'd go and I'd sit and meditate for an hour, and I would just do this loving kindness. And he'd come up to me after the meditation and get right up in my face and going, "You've been doing metta." Because I was just getting blissed out. I would just go in there and I would just be, I think he said he could see it in my eyes, like I was stoned, just doing metta, just getting this blissed. And so when we started, kind of investigating this, I was like, yeah, I used to get into that kind of state, thinking that that's what loving kindness was. And I had this realization that what I was doing was, I was using metta. I call them now Metabombs. So like if I was having difficulty with somebody or just a difficulty in my life, I would try to obliterate it just by blowing it up with loving kindness. And so there's a reason I probably was having aversion towards it when I got to the monastic form. So I realized, well, okay, I'm not using that skillfully or the best of my ability. So that was when I started looking at it. And then we were, at one point during this winter retreat, we were just reading the Buddha's words on loving kindness, the chant that we often do. And I think we may have been listening to Bhikkhu Bodhi. He was talking about it, and he's a brilliant scholar, and he was going through and just talking about like all the verb different changes in the sutta, where it kind of starts off with like future, like this is what should be done, this is what you need to develop, and like this is what it is, and this is what will happen. And there's many different layers to the sutta. But he points out, he says there's only one place in the entire sutta actually where it says what loving kindness, what metta is. And he says it's an intention. It's not that feeling of being blissed out. It's not sending it to somebody. It's just an intention. It's the intention of non-ill will. That's really what loving kindness is. And I remember when we said that, we were at this table, and I was like, I can do that. No, I can't. but yeah, that's something I can do. Like I can't always develop this feeling of being blissed out, or I can't always even wish people well. I can't always be kind and generous. But I can always just not be wishing somebody else's harm. That I can do. And that's what Bhikkhu Bodhi is pointing out. That's really when loving kindness, what it comes down to is that. So around that time when I was kind of really taking it more seriously, studying, I remembered Ajahn Pasano, my teacher in Abhayagiri, had mentioned that there had been a novice at Wat Pah Nanachat like 30 years ago that was interested in metta as a practice, as a concentration practice. And there was a very senior Thai monk in Bangkok. And one of the monks from Wat Pah Nanachat, I guess he was a French monk, was living with that monk. And so it was actually from Ajahn Brahm's monastery in Australia, Ajahn Sujato. You may have heard of him. He was the novice. And so he was writing to this French monk, and the French monk then would take Sujato's notes and translate them into French so he could understand the questions better, and then take it to the Thai monk and then ask him questions in probably not the greatest Thai, write the answers down, translate it back into French, and then write it into English and send it to Sujato. So it's this really kind of a mystery novel as you're reading it, because it's like, I'm missing like probably 60% of what was originally asked to it. The answer's coming back. But there were a lot of really fascinating bits of information there, and it wasn't really organized as a kind of like a teaching manual, but it was really thick. It was like several hundred pages of information. And so I was reading this for a winter retreat. I asked Ajahn Pasno if I could take those notes and just use that as my meditation practice, sort of working through that and ask him questions about it. He agreed to do that. And one point, Sujato asked the question to this Thai monk, and he had some very specific sort of answers that he was looking for, or suggesting. He basically said, what is metta? He says, is it the phrases that we're doing? Is it the feeling that arises? Is it the sending of it to the other person? Is it their receiving it? Is it, he just came up with this list. And I was really impressed. The teacher said, it's none of those. That's not what metta is. He said the phrases, that's the skill, that's the technique. That's the technique to do it. The feeling that you arise is sort of a byproduct. The sending of it is pretty wise. It's a nice thing to do to somebody. If they receive it, that's like icing on the cake. But what it is an intention. And that's what he said too. He just came right back. It's the intention of non-ill will. So it's like getting this reinforced. The second time, I'm like, oh, okay, I can see that. I can really get it now. I like that too. It's just that, all those things that Sujato had asked, they are appropriate for the practice, but it's the means to get there. So that was just, looking at, I'm probably, if I went back and listened to the very first teachings I ever received on metta, it was probably the teachers there even said that, but for some reason, my mind was getting attached to the feeling, getting attached to the idea of sending it, or my misunderstanding. So to come back and get that again, that's, for myself anyway, that's one reason I had aversion, because I think I was trying to cultivate the wrong thing as the main part of the practice. Then the other one that is Ajahn Chachai, I believe is how you pronounce his name, was the Thai monk who was teaching metta as a concentration practice. And he pointed out that, because the way he was doing it was like is not just a preliminary, it is the practice of developing the phrases and bringing up the feeling and cultivating that. As a concentration practice, you don't send it. So one of the chants in here we do is for the Brahma viharas. Loving kindness is one of those factors. There's a chant that says, I will abide, pervading one quarter, with a mind imbued with loving kindness, likewise the second, likewise the third, likewise the fourth, so above as below, all around, all encompassing. I spread these thoughts of goodwill, and so it's in the sutta even that you're sending loving kindness. And Ajahn Chachai said, no, as a concentration practice, you need that energy within yourself. You need to concentrate within yourself, and you only send it after you kind of get into being able to develop jhana. Like once your mind is really being able to stay with the object for, he doesn't give a specific length of time, but he kind of says if you can go through, and maybe I'll talk about this, but if you can go through the entire sort of categories and you stay really focused on your meditation object for like a half hour, 45 minutes, if you can do that, your mind is concentrated, and you put yourself in a position where jhana could arise. So it's not guaranteed it'll happen, but you'll be close, and then it may or may not arise, and we may or may not have the conditions to be able to reach jhana, but we can get ourselves as close as we can, and if they're there, they'll develop. And so Yeah, so just this idea of, and it's not inappropriate, like if you're just using loving kindness as a way of making the mind bright and energetic and happy for a meditation, then at the end of the meditation, if you were doing, if you're not using it as a full-on concentration practice, like if you have a 10-day retreat or longer, if you're just doing it in daily life, and then you do want to think about other people and feel like you're sending it, that's not a problem. But if you're using it as a concentration practice, it's we don't send it. So I think at most, when I was using it, I kind of was using it as a concentration practice. So it's almost like, I think there's a version, because like you're building up that ability to have those beautiful mind states and the feeling inside the body, and then you're really like giving it away. And then next day you got to build it back up again, and then you got it, but then you give it away. It's like, and so it's just this kind of continual roller coaster you're going through. And so, yeah, Ajahn Chachai was saying, just keep it steady, and that would help too. Maybe I'll talk real quickly here. How Ajahn Chachai was saying how to develop the practices. What I mentioned was, however the easiest way to develop it. So if you're developing it towards an inanimate object or a pet, ideally we'd be doing ourselves, the way it's described in the suttas, the Visuddhimagga. You start with yourself, and then you go to just the next, almost kind of like more difficult person. So like I say, if you're the easiest, then maybe your teacher would be your next easiest person to do, and then the next easiest person might be your friend, and then you do a neutral person, and then you do what's called the difficult person. And so what the instructions were to do as like a long practice would be to do yourself for about 15 minutes. And there was a sort of a technique of where you'd sort of start off with meditation on the body, on the breath for just a few minutes to get totally focused. And then he had us actually like then contemplating like death contemplations, like contemplating the skeleton, imagining yourself as a skeleton. And then once you kind of establish that, and I think that's because of, it makes it kind of serious, it's like we're contemplating death, we're contemplating the body. And so it's like, it's not just this meditation that's fun and light, but it's serious. So you bring the seriousness in, and then you start doing the loving kindness. And it would be like doing those phrases and really trying to get the feeling going, and then staying with that for, he said, 15 minutes. And what I like too is that, you develop it for 15 minutes. And once you've been able to do that and you realize like the mind hasn't wandered, other thoughts might come in, you might hear airplanes or the cat walking through, but but the mind stayed on on your meditation subject. You didn't get distracted and start planning tomorrow's meal or something. You stayed with it, even though those thoughts came and went. You just stayed with it. So. But after you can do that for about 15 minutes, then you go on to the next category. You think of, say, your teacher, and you bring them into your mind. And then he said only do that for 5 minutes. So if you can say yourself 15, then that person for 5. Then you'd go to a good friend, 5 minutes, neutral person for 5 minutes, and then the difficult person. And that'd be about 20 minutes as well, doing that person. So it's about 45 minutes kind of when you get through this. And the thing I liked about his instruction though, he says at any point when you are in this, you get distracted. The tendency is like we want to be able to do the difficult person. We want to get to the finish line. He says, no, you start from scratch. As soon as you know you're lost, go back, imagine yourself as a skeleton, or go back to the breathing just until you can just be present. And then start with yourself again. And I like this because it's it's taking out the craving to become, to do the next one, to get further. And I didn't really see the significance of this until maybe it's like 5 or 6 years ago. I was giving a talk to a group in Portland Friends of the Dhamma, and somebody asked me this question, and I didn't even know the answer, but and sometimes when you're teaching or giving, talking about it, you say stuff you didn't even know you knew. And I forget exactly what the question was, but my response was, I said, when you're doing the other beings, I think it was something like, how can you send kindness to someone who's difficult, or, it's often translated as the enemy, which I don't like, but, the difficult person. So how can you send kindness or be thinking kind thoughts about someone who's difficult? And I said, you don't. Again, because it's like you're not sending. But I said, what you do is that feeling of kindness that you're developing, like when you think of yourself, like, may I be happy. If you have this memory, this feeling of what it is for you to be happy, and it's like, and you're holding this, I even described it this way, like you're holding that bowl completely filled with water, and maybe a cat, but it's just completely filled, and you just have to be really, really, concentrated, and you're having that thought, of the feeling of being happy. And so you're holding that, and then you're not actually sending it to anybody. Like when you go to the next person, it's like if I was going to do, say, then Ajahn Pasano, my teacher, I wouldn't be sending it to him. What you're doing is you're holding that person in your mind. So I'm thinking of Ajahn Pasano and wishing him well. So it's like, and not wishing him well, I'm feeling what it was, the joy, the happiness that I was feeling when I was thinking, when I'm joyful, this is what I feel like. So you develop that feeling. You keep that feeling going even while I'm thinking about Ajahn Pasano. And then when you can do that for 5 minutes, then you go to your good friend, or you go to the neutral person. And the significance of that is that, well, the way this progression works is that, finish that point though. So like when you get to any of those people, or the difficult persons, like how can I be filled with joy or happiness even while thinking about this person who's making my life difficult? And when you do that, your mind is very expansive. It's very concentrated. Like you're focusing on just the joy. But I can have that person be there as well. It doesn't have to be exclusive. And so that's how I think that works. And then as a practice of like how you're developing, what I see happen, like why also Ajahn Chachai was saying not just to try to get from point A to point B, but just keep going back to the beginning. It's like when I'm developing that goodwill, or just what it feels like to be happy, then when you do it for yourself for 15 minutes, you're pretty concentrated at that point, just being able to stay with it. But then when I think of my teacher, I have those thoughts of him, it'd be like, having that feeling of, even just saying the phrases, may you be happy, and, and why did you yell at me yesterday? Oh, wait, I'm not meditating, I'm having judgments about my teacher, or why did he teach that, oh, okay, I'm distracted again. So you're actually developing your concentration by being able to bring somebody else in. And so what you do is like when you start with ourselves, we have all sorts of reasons we don't like ourselves or whatever, just that we can get distracted, or the mind doesn't want to be there. So we learn those about ourselves in that first 15 minutes. And then when you go to the next, to your teacher, it's a whole completely different set of reasons we get lost. And then when you go to your best friend, it's like, again, same thing, like you might be meditating, wishing them well, and then like, they're spending a lot of time with Sally now. It's like, I wonder if they like Sally more than me. Like, oh, okay, I'm back to doing myself again. And so you start, completely different reasons you'll get lost. And so it's just another way of getting deeper and deeper and deeper into your concentration and staying focused on what you're doing. So that's one thing I really, really loved. And then the last point I have is that we talk about loving kindness as you can sign up for retreats that are just completely based on loving kindness. But it's actually one of 4. It's called the Brahma viharas. It's one of 4 practices. Metta is the first one, of goodwill. Karuna, compassion. Mudita is joy at other people's good fortune. And then upekkha, which is equanimity. And the way I like to talk about this, and I've never heard anybody else talk about it this way, is that like when you're doing loving kindness or wishing well for other people, what we're really doing is we're opening the heart. We're kind of opening the heart to all beings and wishing, all beings be well. But when we open up our heart, we're opening it up to great joy in the world. We're also opening our heart up to suffering. And I think that's another reason why we have aversion to the practice, where I was mentioning, I think we have these ups and downs. So if we start doing loving kindness a lot, or if it's our primary practice, you will find that you'll get really high at times, because there is a lot of joy in the world. There is a lot of goodness happening, or you just start recognizing joy or beauty in other people that you've maybe not noticed before, because you're actually wishing that. So you start seeing it. So you get this high, and then all of a sudden it crashes, and so it's just up and down, up and down. And we kind of think well, I'm doing this wrong. It shouldn't be this way. If it's this so chaotic or the energetic like that. And so I think that's one of the reasons that people have aversion towards this practice. But if you do it in terms of, I think all four of these Brahma viharas need to be cultivated simultaneously. So it's with the loving kindness, you're opening up to great joy, and you're opening it up to sorrow and pain. And that's where compassion, karuna, and mudita come in. So mudita is this joy at other people's good fortune. So it's sort of and I won't get into this, like I say, it could be a whole week retreat just talking about these, but it's with the joy at other people's good fortune, it can be as subtle as, I am so glad you won the lottery, and remember me. There's just a little bit of attachment there, or it can be, just downright sort of jealous of them, that kind of thing. And then with compassion, it's, when there is suffering, it's just, the heart can rise up from that suffering to care about, their suffering. So the way I see this is, and then what I see equanimity is, it's often talked about as being an anchor or a post, sort of just to keep us solid. There's one analogy of it, sort of like a post in an ocean, and the tide comes in and out, and there's a ball that's tied to it, and the tides just make it go all over the place, but the post is just always steady and kind of rock solid. So the way I see all the Brahma Viharas working together is that the heart is this receptacle. It's opening up. We're opening up to the world. And then there's this, actually I see it as this tube that comes out from the heart. And so that's out here. But then it's got these two wings on it. That's the mudita and the compassion. So it's as it starts getting turbulent, one of those will raise up to keep us level. And then the equanimity is the sort of pivot point where it's all attached to the heart. So it's got the swivel on the post there. So I really think all four of those need to be developed at the maybe not at the same sitting, but they all need to be understood and practiced with, and just realize that, okay, I want to do loving kindness today, but actually compassion is where I need to be, or I need to be with mudita, or I need to be with just equanimity today. So there's different practices that can be all done at the same time. I can't believe I got through all that. So we have another 50 minutes or so to practice. So why don't I'll let you choose what you want to do right now, but say from 3 to 3:35. If you want to just continue sitting or standing here, or if you want to go walk, please do that. And wait, can you ring the bell at 3:30? And then we'll come back here and we'll have a question and answer period. And nobody has any questions, we just sit.